Hello to everyone and welcome to our very first webinar in our series from the University of California Integrated Pest Management Urban and Community webinar series. So I am Karey Windbiel-Rojas. I am the Associate Director for the Urban and Community Program. I'm also a local area IPM advisor serving three counties in Northern California, Sacramento, Yolo, and Solano. All right, so why we are all here today is to listen and learn and refresh ourselves on what is integrated pest management. And integrated pest management is what we do. This is our main focus. We're going to today give kind of an overview of the topics that are listed here. What is a pest? What are the components of integrated pest management and what do they mean? And then we'll have a couple of examples of pest management in and around the home and also in the landscape and the garden. So the first thing when we're talking about integrated pest management is to define or at least discuss what is a pest, because what is a pest to one person may not be a pest to someone else. I didn't give a trigger warning that we have slides with spiders on them, but we do have a few slides that have pictures of spiders. And spiders is one of those pests that some people think are pests that a number of folks in our communities are really afraid of. And so for some people, they don't want any spiders, they don't want to see them, they don't want to know about them. But spiders are also beneficial. And so it may just be what you are comfortable with, whether you love spiders, hate spiders, are indifferent. But there are different categories of pests that may be problems in our gardens or in our homes. And so there's plant diseases, there are vertebrate pests or animal pests, there are weeds and weeds that you don't want growing someplace, but this picture is of a type of clover, and some people like clovers. And hey, yesterday was St. Patrick's Day, and we celebrate the clover, but you might not want it in your lawn. And then there's, of course, invertebrates or insects, spiders, snails. And so if it's a pest to you, then you might find that you want to do something about it, and someone else may not think it's a pest. And so what a pest is an organism, some sort of animal or plant or disease that might annoy us. It might cause damage to our structures, to our plants, or even to our person. Fleas can be considered pests or are considered pests, and they can be a problem on our pets, obviously. But as I just mentioned, pests are personal. It may not be a pest to your neighbor, and it might be a pest to you, and they can be indoors and outdoors in different situations at different times of year. And so when we think about the home and landscape and what kind of pests we have, in that first slide showing the pictures, I listed the categories of pests that we consider. And that is the invertebrates is the first or a category of pests. That includes insects, but also spiders, mites, snails and slugs, what we call invertebrates. Then we have the vertebrate pests, which are rodents, larger animals, and things that might be in our homes or in our landscapes or just out there as wildlife and not causing us problems at all. There are diseases that cause problems on plants, such as bacteria and fungi and viruses and other kinds of pathogen-inducing problems. And so we call those plant pathogens. And then, of course, there's weeds. And so weeds are considered a pest when they are growing in a place we don't want them. But otherwise, they're just plants. Other things that can cause damage to our landscape and our gardens and our plants are things that are not actually pests, but are abiotic or environmental factors. And so when we are considering what is causing a problem or why is my plant unhealthy, not only could it be a pest, but we also have to consider these abiotic factors, such as water, too much water, not enough water. Um, I would imagine most of you are joining us from California, and so we know that California is drought prone, and especially in certain areas, and so water can be a big issue for plant health. There are areas that get hot and sunny more than others, or very windy, and sun and wind can also damage plants. We have lots of different soil components that can either be too much for certain plants to grow and thrive, or materials that are lacking in our soil. So minerals and nutrients are important for plant health, and adjusting them is something that we often do to make sure that our plants are healthy. But other factors that can cause damage could be the application of herbicides or weed killers or other kinds of pesticides that may damage a plant and we didn't mean for that to happen. So there could be cases where you didn't apply something but your neighbor did, or you forgot that you applied a material and it ended up causing some damage to a plant. And so pesticides can cause unwanted damage. And then there's mechanical injury. Mechanical injuries are things that we might do to a plant that uh, that cause damage. So over pruning, or pruning the wrong part, or mowing down some desirable plants when you meant to mow down some weeds or the grass, um, leaving soccer balls or other kinds of equipment or toys out on the lawn. Lots of things that can cause mechanical damage. So it's important to consider all these factors. And in this webinar, we're going to talk about integrated pest management as a whole. And we are going to continue to have webinars that will get further into a lot of these issues. And one of the webinars we will offer in the future is diagnosing plant problems and trying to figure out what is causing the issue. So very quickly, because we can't cover everything today, there are many different look-alike issues that could cause problems on our plant. You can see all three of these plants are showing curling damage. And curling damage can be caused by sucking insects or diseases, or some of those abiotic issues that I just mentioned. And so it's important to differentiate between the different causes of plant injury. And often it's knowing the plant host that will really help us diagnose. Not all pests attack all plants. And so if you have in the left hand, that is a peach tree showing peach leaf curl. The middle one is a cherry tree showing feeding by aphids. And the far one is a sycamore tree showing herbicide damage. All three of those are different plants that have different pests that may attack one kind and not another. And so knowing your host plant will really help narrow down your pest issue. And there are the labels right there. So our next, just to illustrate look-alike damage and trying to help, identify the problem, we have to look at signs and symptoms of damage. And you can see in all three of these pictures, there's little white spots from the whatever's causing this problem. We see the white spots. And so knowing what we see and being able to document what our observations are will help us then figure out what is causing the problem. So in these cases, all three of the pests that are listed there, web spinning mites, leaf hoppers, and thrips, they all cause similar looking damage to each other. And so knowing the host plant, hopefully capturing some of the organisms, or being just a bit of a detective, will allow you to end up at the correct identification of the pest, which is really important in integrated pest management. So what is IPM? Integrated pest management is where we use this concept to identify our pest and find the best solutions to manage it. And we don't usually say control or eradicate because that's not really the goal. The goal is to manage the pests to levels that we can be comfortable with. Sometimes that level is zero. Sometimes that level is just, a few aphids is okay, a few ants are okay. But the important thing to do is to monitor and detect what are we seeing? What are some of those symptoms and signs? And then to assess, well, I've found some damage to my plants and it's causing unsightly um, you know aesthetics, or there's something chewing all my flowers. And so you're going to be in your space looking and observing what's going on. The next step is to properly, correctly identify the pest. You cannot control a pest that you don't know what it is you're controlling. You can try and you might waste some time and money and efforts doing so, but we we encourage everyone to properly identify the pest first before any action is taken. Even if the pest is part of a group, right? All of ants, all of the cockroaches, all of the aphids, sometimes they're managed differently depending on where you find them and what plant they're on or what species they are. And so the pest identification is crucial, and then knowing about that pest. And that's where the UCIPM program can come in. We have lots of information about how to identify, um, you know, uh, things to consider in the biology and the habitat, and then the management. And we'll talk about that more a little bit too. Once you determine you have a pest that you need to manage, then it's bringing in the different strategies that we'll talk about soon, bringing all of these practices and strategies together to get the best kind of management possible. And so the term integrated pest management, we are managing our pests using an integration or a combination of various tools and tactics to arrive at the best pest control or pest management that we can. And hopefully these tools in combination will provide long-term management, and in some cases, even prevention of the pest. So we always want to talk about why would we choose integrated pest management? Why do we practice IPM? And as I just mentioned, long-term solutions. If we can try and manage pests before they really get out of hand, or if we can keep the pest numbers low, that's going to be better for our efforts and sometimes economical. When we talk about pest management in agriculture, we want to make sure that we are not having a huge infestation that's going to be economically damaging. But around the home and garden, we don't want to be spending a whole bunch of time just, battling the pests in our gardens and homes. We want some long-term solutions so that we can do other things. And so that may be managing these potential problems before they get out of hand and there's a big infestation. IPM gives us choices that often don't require the use of pesticides. And so I'll talk about some components of IPM and where pesticides may fit in. And by not turning straight to a pesticide or making sure we choose the right pesticide, that will hopefully eliminate the unnecessary, indiscriminate use of pesticides, which is going to be good for the environment and good for our health, for our pets, for our plants, and overall, that is the goal of the UCIPM program and integrated pest management in other areas. So I mentioned these components of IPM. Prevention is one of the, the, the first components that we want to try and have happen if possible. Can we prevent the pest from even reaching our plants or coming indoors or biting us, right? We know about prevention for mosquitoes. We wear long sleeves and we, try and cover up, or using repellent, or, having screens on our doors and windows. These are all ways that we can prevent the pest from reaching us. And prevention can be used both in the garden and landscape for keeping pests out or away. Lots of different ideas that we'll continue to talk about in this presentation. But there's also the concept of cultural controls. And I'm going to go into each one of these in a little bit. Cultural controls are where we modify the habitat to make it not inviting for a pest or not attractive to a pest. So habitat management. Physical or mechanical controls are just that. You're going to physically control the pest. You're going to mechanically do something to get rid of the pest. It could be squishing, it could be pruning off an area, etc. And I'll have more examples of that in a moment. Then part of IPM is biological control, using the naturally occurring organisms that may consume the pest for us or might parasitize the pests. And so we'll talk about how biological control can help in our IPM efforts. And then part of integrated pest management is chemical control or the use of pesticides. And we do usually talk about that last because, as I said, if we can try all of these other things, prevention, cultural, physical, biological, then we may not have to use pesticides. But pesticides are a component of an integrated pest management strategy. So as I mentioned, prevention, what can we do in and around the home to prevent pests? Well, one of the best ways is to exclude the pests from coming indoors. So you can see by this photo that the gentleman is applying caulk to a small opening around a water spigot. Pests can use any kind of small entrance they can find to get in, and you'd be surprised at how some larger pests seem to be able to get into your home through some cracks. But as I said, with mosquitoes, you can install window screens and make sure that they are kept, properly kept up, and there aren't rips and tears and openings. Sealing holes and cracks, and replacing any kind of weather stripping around doors. All of these are really great exclusion tactics from keeping pests out. Then there is the concept of sanitation, cleaning up spills. Pests are just organisms that are trying to survive, and so they are looking for space or shelter, food, and that includes vertebrate pests and animal pests and diseases. They're feeding on your plants, and weeds are feeding from the soil. And so you want to limit the food. So cleaning up water spills or crumbs in the kitchen, anything that is attracting the pest to come inside and then want to stay. And removing clutter. Clutter is a great hiding place for rodents or spiders or bed bugs or other kinds of organisms, and some food that may be attractive. So sealing up attractive foods or cleaning up any kind of attractive foods or putting things away. There's lots and lots of examples depending on what kind of pests you may be experiencing and things that you can do to prevent them. In the landscape and garden, you can do prevention as well. You can exclude weeds by putting down a landscape fabric. You can install what we call mowing strips, which are physical barriers to keep some weeds that creep from one area to another, keeping this physical barrier, not allowing those weeds to move. Trimming trees that are close to structures. Some pests that will get into our structures, if we do exclude them by closing up a hole over here, they may find another way in by climbing up trees and then accessing our homes and structures that way. So various examples of what to do for exclusion. Lots of people exclude flying insects by covering their plants with a kind of cloth or a mesh, or putting them in a greenhouse. Many examples. Also outside is sanitation. So disposing of fallen fruit that may be attracting pests, fixing leaky faucets that may have extra water for pests to either drink or for weeds to grow, and sealing up garbage, which might attract vertebrate pests or flies. Compost, same thing. So again, many things that can be done. Moving on to cultural controls in the landscape and garden, there are habitat modifications that we can do. Maybe rotating the crops so that soil dwelling pests that may have been there from the previous crop, you plant a new kind of crop that those soil pests do not like, and they will eventually die. And so planting tomatoes in the same bed every year after year, you may experience a nematode problem. And so changing up what you're growing in the same bed or same location is good for habitat modification. Making sure you select the right plant for the right location. Is there enough sun? Is there too much sun? What are the conditions that that plant needs to thrive? So we say the right plant for the right place. And doing that will make sure that the plant is healthy and able to withstand perhaps some minor pest issues. And then of course there's irrigation, the right amount of irrigation for your soil type, for what that plant needs, and adjusting it through the season or for whatever happens in your landscape, um, and making sure that you keep your irrigation system um, monitored. So I mentioned the plant selection, so site selection, making sure that it's the right site for that plant, and perhaps amending the soil and other conditions that allow the plant to thrive. And there are cultivars of plants that are resistant to certain diseases or nematodes. And so you can plant resistant cultivars. You can plant plants that don't actually have a lot of pests that normally attack it. Some people who might be in more wildland areas where you have vertebrate pests or deer, you can find some plants that deer don't love as much. I mean, deer will kind of eat anything, but there are some plants that are not as attractive to deer. And so making sure that you're planting something that may not be as pest prone. And then proper fertilizing and pruning, and just knowing how to take care of the plant in optimal conditions. And then I did mention disposing of fallen fruit. The fruit can harbor diseases and insects, and also be attractive to other pests, snails and slugs, ants, and vertebrate pests. And so making sure that you're keeping your area clean and not attractive to pests. Physical controls, I mentioned a few. So the exclusion, the sealing of cracks and holes using caulking or other materials really depends on the level of the opening. And keeping up screens. And it's not just window screens. There are vents that need screens, and other potential entryways to buildings that you want to make sure you have proper good fitting screens so that vertebrate pests can't get in, and rodents like rats and mice. Um, there's using traps to trap some pests, and traps can be used for a couple things in IPM. Traps can be used for just monitoring to see where are the pests, where are they in the home, where are they in the landscape, and so some traps that are useful for having knowing the number of flying insects you might have in your tree or in your garden. And so traps can be useful for monitoring and for also catching the organism. So for vertebrates, you can use mouse traps or rat traps to actually catch and control the organism. In this slide, I've mentioned rodents a couple of times, and I want to say, so I don't forget later, that we will in a couple of months have a presentation on this webinar for integrated pest management for rodents. So I won't be covering everything today. We're giving an overview, and we'll get into different subjects as we go along. But there's also removal, physical removal of a pest. You can use a fly swatter to physically hit the flies, right? That's one of the oldest IPM tools that I like to talk about, that most people are familiar with. You can vacuum up pests, and that's a really great way indoors to control some pests, and other ways to physically remove. If you have fruit flies in the house, you can physically remove the fruit that is attracting them, and you'll get rid of the fruit flies as well. Out in the landscape and garden, you can use mulches and other barriers to minimize the weeds and block them, physically block them from growing. You can use soil solarization to heat up the soil in an area and to kill some of the pests in the soil. And so that's another physical control. Again, trapping with various kinds of either sticky monitoring traps or like what's shown here, that's a vertebrate trap called a conibear trap. And so many different examples. And the picture in the upper left is showing someone using a flame weeder, which is a type of physical um, uh, control for weeds where you heat up the weed. You don't burn it to a crisp, but you heat up the weed enough to where the cells are going to break down. Mowing is another physical control, as well as being a cultural control. And then the picture with the roses is using a strong stream of water to knock pests off of plants. Especially, it works well for aphids on sturdy plants like roses. Moving into biological control. Biological control is where you have one species that reduces the adverse effects of another. And we tend to talk more about insect and arachnid control, but there's biological control in nature where, you know, a larger animal eats a smaller animal that might be a pest. But so today we'll mainly have examples of these invertebrates. So we tend to call the agents of biological control, we call them natural enemies. And they are natural in that they occur naturally, and they are not our enemies. They are the enemies of our pests. So we use the term biological control agents, beneficial insects, beneficial organisms, and natural enemies. Some people say good bugs. And you can see that spiders are here too. So they're not all insects. Some are spiders, and they can control a lot of pests for us. Within biological control, there are different categories that we cover: the parasites, the predators, and the pathogens. And so I just have a few slides on biological control. We'll have another webinar where we get further into biological control at another date. But for parasites, parasites are things that are going to, take over another organism. And so very generally, there are parasitic wasps and flies that will lay their eggs in or on their host. And this can be very specific. One kind of natural enemy or one kind of parasite will only attack one specific host. But the females will lay their eggs in or on, and then the eggs will hatch to larvae. The larvae will feed on their host and eventually kill it. And you can see in these pictures that there's a healthy aphid in the middle of the first picture on the left, and a discolored, what we call a mummy. And it's called a mummy because it kind of blows up and gets discolored. And then what will hatch out or emerge out of that mummy is what is shown in the picture on the right, which is a small parasitic wasp. So this happens in nature, and it's happening all the time. While the host is there, the parasite will find it. And so there are many different examples of these parasitic wasps and also flies. So once we offer the biological control webinar, come back and find out more about that. And so there are predators as well. Predators can be in the garden. They can also be in the home. You can find spiders both in the home and in the garden, and they may be eating some of our pest species. So you can see the spider in the middle is a jumping spider. And if you can see the wings, it's eating a fly. And so you may have flies in the home or outside, and spiders are great predators that will catch things either in their webs, or there are many spiders that don't make webs. The picture on the left is showing a house centipede, which can also help control some pests in the home. And then in the garden, there are a number of naturally occurring biological control agents, such as praying mantids, which will attack just about anything they can get their mouthpieces on, but also what's shown here, green lacewings and lady beetles, otherwise known as ladybugs. And there are many species of lady beetles. One in particular that a lot of people are familiar with are the ones that you can buy commercially in the store or order online. And those are the convergent lady beetle. They are named convergent because of these two lines that are on this covering over its head. These two lines converge, and so the beetle was named the convergent lady beetle. So they are really easy to find in the garden, and you can also recognize the life stages. And we talk about the life stages of both pests and beneficials because we want to make sure people recognize that if they see these brightly colored eggs like this that have the same shape and are standing up on a surface, that they recognize them as beneficial insects and don't try and clear them off. Those eggs are going to hatch out to this larva that doesn't look anything like the adult. And so recognizing the different stages of the biological control agents will help us know that, oh, this isn't a pest, this is actually a good bug, and let's make sure to take care of it. And then this is the pupal stage of the lady beetle. So again, when we have our biocontrol talk, we'll get more into different kinds of lady beetles and other organisms. So lastly, in IPM, we do consider pesticides if necessary. And necessary is again, one of those personal terms. It may never be necessary in your garden to use a pesticide. It may be never necessary in your house to use a pesticide. And so whether you think you need a pesticide is a personal decision. So many gardeners do have beautiful gardens and landscapes and don't use any pesticides. Um, but we do educate on pesticides quite a bit within our program because pesticides range in toxicity to plants and other organisms. Some are fairly benign and don't have much negative impact, but others can be quite toxic to ourselves and to other organisms, including some of those biological control agents. We will have another talk, or probably more than one, on pesticides, where we'll get more into what does it mean to be an organically acceptable pesticide. And just because something is organically acceptable doesn't mean that it is non-toxic. There are some organic pesticides that are quite toxic to human health and the environment. And so we always want to make sure that people understand that there are impacts to pesticides that need to be considered before they are used. And that some pesticides that may have been previously thought of as safe or safer, we come to find later that they have other negative impacts in our environment. And so we will definitely be getting more into pesticides and talking about their use in and around landscapes and homes. And uh, very briefly though, for this webinar, if you're going to be using pesticides, we encourage you to try the prevention first and cultural controls, physical and biological, before turning to a chemical. And so using these other kinds of controls to see if you can get rid of your pest before turning to a pesticide first, and using the pesticides with these other strategies. You should always choose your pesticides carefully, using the least toxic material, least toxic to you and the non-target organisms, but you want something that's going to be effective on the pest. And again, correct identification of the pest is important, or you might get the wrong pesticide that doesn't even control that pest at all. And then that has more, that may be more costly, and you might have more exposure to that pesticide that ended up not working. And so you always want to follow pesticide directions and instructions and mixing if it needs to be mixed, and coverage, and reading that label. So we will have additional webinars coming up soon where we go over reading a pesticide label, where we go over personal protective equipment and understanding pesticides a little bit more because people are using them. And we do want to point out for everyone here that weed killers or herbicides are pesticides too. And organic pesticides are still pesticides. Things you make up in your home to kill a pest, you made a pesticide. So without spending too much more time on that, I just wanted to make sure and share that today. And the University of California has a great deal of information and publications on what kind of controls work for what kind of pests, and that includes when pesticides are needed. We want to make sure, I think this is second to last slide on pesticides, that you are making sure you're targeting the pest that you want to control, and not a broad spectrum or very toxic pesticide that's going to kill more than just your targeted pest. And paying attention to the label and the environmental impacts, what hazards are to people, to pets, to the beneficials, and what water quality concerns are there, and that may or may not be listed on the label. What are the impact on bees? Honeybees can be negatively impacted by pesticides because they are insects as well. And so the bees and the parasites and these predators, what are the impacts of the pesticide on them? And then how easy is it for the package for you to understand how to use it? If it seems really complicated and you have to mix up and measure, maybe you don't want to get a concentrated pesticide. You want to get something that has a spray bottle. But if you buy a spray bottle and you have a big tree, maybe you need other kinds of spray equipment. So you always want to read the label and make these considerations before you buy the pesticide and leave the store, and make sure you have all the equipment that you need. So just really quickly, and again, we'll come back to pesticides at a later webinar. There are many examples of pesticides out there that are less toxic. So I want to give you just a couple examples of some pests, and then we'll pause for some questions. But in the home, there are several different kinds of pests that might find their way in, and we don't want them to be comfortable. So we're going to encourage, cleaning and vacuuming, and reducing clutter and hiding places, maybe mopping up spills, or keeping the cat food or the dog food nice and tidy, or certain kinds of feeding dishes that won't be attractive to pests. Removing pests, removing the attractive food, and trapping some of them. And in some cases, you may need to hire a professional if the pest problem is more than you can handle. And the professionals are trained in pest management. That is what they do. And so for indoor pests, that might be the situation. So we have two case studies that I just want to quickly go through. For some of the common indoor pests, such as ants. With ants, there are many species of ants. There are more than 250 species of ants in California. Not all of them are going to be pests in the house, but there are, a dozen or more that want to come in the house, that will be attracted to the conditions inside structures. And so it's really important, before any kind of management is undertaken, is to correctly identify what kind of ant you have. That will allow you to find the best management strategy, and to understand what the ant is looking for, or maybe hiding. Is it a carpenter ant? Is it an Argentine ant? The top picture here shows an odorous house ant. They might eat different foods at different times of the year. Some are attracted to sweets, some are attracted to proteins, some are attracted to both. And so correct identification, and UCIPM has tools to help you do that, and then learning about them. And again, we have information for that. So I won't go through the management because we don't really have time, but there are lots of things that I've already talked about, excluding them, cleaning up spills, and doing these cultural or physical controls before any kind of pesticide. But anything that you do should be in combination. You're going to get the best level of control if you combine these different tactics. And again, if it's too much or it's the infestation is too large, when you first experience the pest issue, calling a professional may help you get it um, dealt with quicker and with less headache. Rats are another potential indoor pest. Rats can be indoors or outdoors, just like ants, but you want to identify them correctly. There's different species of ants, and they have different habitats. Some might be low on the ground and underneath, and some might be higher in structures and attics and trees. So you want to make sure that you get the correct identification. Then knowing about them will allow any kind of management strategies to work the best. Where to set the traps, how to set the traps, um, you know, what kind of food and what kind of situations are attractive to them. Do they nest indoors, and where might they nest? Where do they travel? Various things. And so it's very important to get the correct identification first. And again, we will have a talk. I think it's in May May or June when we have scheduled our IPM for rodents. It's on the last slide. And hiring a professional if rodent control around the home is something that is hard to do. In the landscape, we want to again, modify the habitat and care for the plants, and cultural controls like mowing and cultivating weeds, using the good bugs, and maybe not using pesticide. It all depends. And so we have several examples that I'll quickly burn through here, just to talk about the different categories of pests. So powdery mildew is a kind of plant disease, and you can see that it causes the white covering over the plant. You can select cultivars of plant that are resistant to powdery mildew. Certain plants have been bred for resistance to various diseases. But having good air circulation, pruning out small infestations, and possibly using some preventative horticultural oils will, all in combination, will help reduce powdery mildew. Weeds, there's a ton we can say about weeds. We will have a presentation on IPM for plant pathogens, and we will also have a presentation on weeds and weed control. But as I mentioned, there are physical controls like mulches and barriers, using soil solarization to kill some of the weed seeds so that they won't germinate and grow. And there's a whole bunch of different pesticides, herbicides that can kill the plant before it germinates, or post-emergence will kill the plant after it germinates. But many different cultural and physical controls that I've already mentioned today. Insect pests, there are hundreds and hundreds of insect pests that can be in our landscapes and gardens. And so one example are aphids. Aphid numbers can climb really high, really fast. They do develop very quickly, and the females are kind of always pregnant and always producing nymphs or immature offspring. And some ants are attracted to the honeydew that aphids produce. And so managing aphids also may necessitate managing the ants that are protecting the aphids. And some of the ants, as they collect the honeydew, will protect aphids from the natural enemies that might come and parasitize or consume. So there's a lot of things with aphids that might need to be considered. But there's a lot of good biological control for aphids. You can hose them off, you can cover your plants, lots of different IPM strategies for aphids. And then with vertebrate pests, depending on the pest, is you got to identify it first and then figure out its biology and habitat. And so I'm not going to read all of this, but there are ground squirrels and there are tree squirrels. Which one do you have? It depends on identification. So if you're going to manage a ground squirrel, you would do it this way. If you're going to manage tree squirrels, there's a whole other set of considerations. But they can cause damage to our trees. And our landscape, you can see the upper picture are really big holes next to some trees. And so those can be tripping hazards or unsightly. They can chew on irrigation lines, eating fruits and nuts from our trees, and various kinds of damage. So whether you have a tree squirrel, or excuse me, a ground squirrel problem that you need to manage, or you just have ground squirrels that are just there, um, that's up to each situation. But we do have lots of strategies written out for managing ground squirrels. And again, we will cover IPM for rodents and vertebrates in later webinars. So that was a big general overview of integrated pest management. I know I was talking very fast, but rest assured, we will cover each and every one of these topics again in further detail as we start offering more webinars. We thank you all so much, and contact your local master gardeners if you have a specific problem.